There we go. All right. So like I said, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining today for our webinar, Cultivating a DevOps Culture, How to Create Change that Drives Value. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into things. Today's webinar is scheduled to last an hour, including time for question and answer. It'll be recorded and emailed out to everyone who's participating tomorrow. So if you're watching the recording, welcome. And questions can be submitted at any time through the GoToWebinar questions panel, and we will be able to read those at the end. Today's speakers, my name is Patrick McVeety-Mill. I'll be facilitating the conversation today with Yogi Aradhye and Bill Ross. We're all principal consultants here at Headspring that have worked in the DevOps space and have a lot of thoughts about culture and what works. So today we'll be going through a recap of DevOps as a whole. Yogi and I gave a webinar about a month ago that went into some of these details. We'll define what we mean when we say DevOps culture. We'll take a look at some examples of what a struggling DevOps culture looks like. Talk through what are the cultural norms for a successful DevOps culture, and then finally talk about where to start with all of this. So to start things off, just a recap from last time. We talked about what are the thousands of foot view of what are engineering goals in general. They are to deliver software as quickly as possible, to deliver correctly, and to meet the business needs. These are the goals of just any type of engineering. Kind of honing in on how DevOps applies to that. DevOps helps deliver value to customers as quickly as possible. It fits into those general engineering goals. The way it does that, at Headspring, we have a very holistic and multifaceted approach to DevOps that includes the typical things like continuous delivery tools, also how we architect our code, how we arrange the work and the process that we go through, how we measure code after it's been deployed, and then finally, just the overall culture and all of the behaviors and norms that go into making the rest of these easy. We talked about how each of those facets of DevOps goes on a scale from smaller and faster changes, like setting up a build server or adding logging, to a larger and slower change, like adjusting how your whole organization's culture is, or changing your flow of work process. So those larger and slower changes can oftentimes be more impactful, but they take longer and are more difficult to achieve. So today we'll be talking about the biggest and baddest of those, but ultimately one of the most important, DevOps culture. And to get into that, I think Bill is going to talk a bit more about what we mean when we say DevOps culture.
Yeah, so I think the term DevOps has taken on a pretty broad meaning. I think we can certainly all agree on some of the obvious points, particularly that DevOps is an integration of two historically separate teams, development and operations, and this alignment helps those teams deliver and execute more quickly. In this respect, I think across various industries, we see a broad adoption of continuous integration, continuous deployment tooling and infrastructure and practices. However, I think there's a lot more to achieving that seamless integration between these two aspects of an organization, and that's where the culture aspect lies. Frequently, we see companies that are quick to adopt new tools, establish DevOps engineering roles in DevOps teams, but stop short of implementing the organizational and cultural changes necessary to make the transformative changes of DevOps possible. So the term culture in and of itself is fairly abstract. When I think of culture in terms of DevOps, I focus on enumerating those tangible behaviors and practices that form how development teams operate within an organization. And I think there's a lot, I think this is where a lot of organizations typically stop short when implementing DevOps.
So yeah, when they stop short, what gets people into trouble when they are trying to build DevOps culture but might miss it?
Yeah, there are some misconceptions about DevOps in general, and I used to have them as well. It's we all start at some point, and I used to think, oh, DevOps means the deployment tooling, and once we have everything automated, that's it. That means I have everything related to DevOps set up. But that's not it. As Bill mentioned, we have to think about what that means into like the larger change that we're talking about earlier, the strategic changes that we can do in our team structures, things like that, that people need to think about. And a lot of times what happens then, that people are realizing now with lots of literature that's out there, that, oh yeah, we need to make these changes, but then they sometimes go to something like having a team that says, oh, this is a DevOps team. And a lot of times on Twitter and job sites, whatever, somebody says, oh, looking for a DevOps engineer. Well, that's not a position, or that's not a team. It's more on more of a culture, more of a practice, a principle that you're looking at. But when you kind of bottle it down into a position, that's when the friction starts coming in. Something similar to that, Google has come up with the site reliability engineers, and they have kind of put that practice in mainstream. It's a great thing out there. And then a lot of times people have confusion between what is this DevOps thing versus what is this site reliability engineering thing. According to Google themselves, what they say is these two are, look at it, these two are different things. Look at them from, let's say DevOps is more of an interface, that the capability that you have, principles that you have, and SRE is an implementation of that implement. It's more of a class from that perspective. So SREs are type of DevOps practices that you're doing at your site, but in your organization, but not necessarily mean that you have all the DevOps culture in your organization. That makes sense. And also, just because Google has SRE or Amazon may have SREs doesn't mean you need to have them as well, and doesn't mean all of a sudden you're a bad company because you don't have SREs. That's not a thing. So that's something that you don't want to do, is just because some big companies are doing it, I need to have a person who has a title, SRE, and then yep, now we have a culture just like Google. That's where people start getting into trouble, just following examples blindly.
And that in our last webinar, we talked about some of these examples from reports like the state of DevOps that comes out from a few organizations, and those are really valuable resources for like how are these these big groups at the forefront of this doing it when they have all these resources, but you can't be too eager about applying those exactly to your own org. You have to find what works. Yogi, you recently worked with a client who is kind of struggling in this area. What were you seeing specifically that was preventing them from realizing that full potential of a DevOps transformation?
Yeah, so I typically work on transformation projects, converting your monolithic application to microservices or distributed systems. And this is kind of a theme that I see in many of the client projects that we take on, is that they have a monolith, and then they kind of like have the tooling in place, everything's automated. They start at a good place. I cannot put enough value on how important that step is. Having automation is important. Having the deployment automation is important. The integration stuff, the automated testing that you do, everything's important. But then they stop short of actually taking that forward and going into those strategic areas that we were talking about culture. And what that does is that introduces small inefficiencies all over the place. So what happens sometimes is when you're making a change in a larger application, you have to hand it over to a different team that's actually deploying and maintaining that code after. So then you're just essentially, as an engineer, as a developer, you are tossing that code over the fence, and it's somebody else's responsibility. So what that does is it makes the other team very uneasy about that, and they're very protective of that particular code that's coming to their land, if you will, because they were not involved from the conception of that change. Somebody else wrote it, and now they have to maintain it. If something goes wrong, they'll have to dig into it for firsthand when something is on fire in production. So that creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of friction, and then that slows down the whole thing. That slows down the entire cycle. This red tape, then they start introducing the red tape. Okay, so I need to double check, triple check all this code that you're sending my way, all these changes you're asking, Patrick. Like, what is this Elasticsearch that you're asking me? All that stuff. Like, okay, just stop sending me all these things. So, so that's kind of thing starts coming in, and then the entire change process starts getting slowed down, and then that starts making the change itself a lot bigger. That adds risk to the entire deal. That adds a lot of friction, and then it's not very efficient at that point.
Right, and that friction can be frustrating and can really permeate into all parts of the business. So what do y'all feel like are the fundamental issues beneath these sort of symptoms of friction and of difficulty?
So Yogi, when you were talking through that example, one of the things that really stood out to me is how it seemed like there were some competing priorities at play within this organization. So it sounds like they had taken some steps towards a DevOps transformation, but still had two teams largely responsible or involved in the development process, but responsible for different aspects, right? So one team was focused on introducing change and driving innovation, whereas another is really focused on stability and management of production. And those two things seem to be at odds at each other from a priority standpoint. Another thing that stood out to me when you were going through that example along similar lines as competing priorities is just the team accountability. All right, with different teams involved in that process and work kind of being handed off from one team to another, each team's accountable for something different that might have been causing some friction as well.
Right, definitely team autonomy. Kind of, sometimes these teams are associated for the business areas, but then eventually all of them come together in operations phase, and then all of a sudden there's this big block, the bottleneck that you have to go through. When these frictions are introduced and happening, and this is something that we have experienced on our client projects. Like I said, when the change size started getting bigger and bigger, you start running into problems. So I worked on a project where 55 odd 60 developer teams were making a change to one application, one monolithic application, and then there used to be this carnival of deployment. Let's do a deployment on Tuesday or whatever the day used to be, and then when you deploy that, everybody's change would go in. But then, as you can imagine, if 55 plus teams are making change to that application, something's going to go wrong because that change is going to be really big. And if that goes wrong, the whole thing gets rolled back. And then because of that, now we can't address those business areas could not address their clients, whatever their business stakeholders were. And that kind of like adds the frustration. And then you don't have this, even though you had these teams supporting those individual business areas, that may give the kind of false impression of, oh, these teams are autonomous, but then they're not, because they are tied to each other, they're coupled with each other, and with one because of their application. Of course, there is architectural issues as well, but then the team structures and cultural issues are playing a huge role here. There's something small that goes wrong, everything's rolled back, and then there's not a lot of team autonomy here.
So all of these things like accountability and responsibility and priorities are elements of a culture, and they ultimately impact how an organization is able to deliver on business goals. What are some ways that we can create alignment in those areas and build autonomy across an organization?
So I think the concept of autonomy is very important. I think one of the ways that teams can focus on building this within organizations is really defining a clear area of responsibility for that team. Yogi, in your example, we kind of saw how there was friction as work was handed off from one team to another because different teams were responsible for different aspects of the delivery process. So it's important that a team be responsible for making product decisions, building the features or the functionality of the systems that they own, for monitoring those in production and supporting them in production, for tracking and establishing metrics like SLAs around their performance. And if we focus on building those things, we arrive at that autonomous team, and it's easy. One of the benefits of that is that it's easy to know who's responsible for issues as they arrive. It also facilitates efficient decision making when it comes to what direction to take a product in, or how to whether or not tech debt should be focused on for a sprint, etc. In essence, I think it's really taking that concept of aligning the operations and development roles and applying that to the entire team, whatever the job specialty of a particular role may be.
Right, because we are talking about here measuring things that matter instead of some book somewhere said that, oh, if you just have this chart, then you can identify your progress. But what we are really measuring here, and Google's, some of the people who work at Google came up with a book, the Accelerate book. They talk about this a lot, that you're measuring what matters the most. Can you deliver the value to your customer? And that's what we're really trying to get towards, instead of just going towards some graph of some kind where we're saying, oh, burn down charts, oh, my burn down charts look better than the next one, and this week it looked better. That doesn't necessarily add value to your customer. You don't know if you actually made the change that mattered, or you were just gaming the system to make that chart look better. So that kind of stuff is, we want to diminish the role of those kind of metrics and go towards more practical metrics that Bill was just mentioning. The other thing I want to bring up here is about communication with your direct customers, direct stakeholders, whoever they are, because it's very important to get the clean sense of what the change is going to be and have that communication with the direct business stakeholder, or in certain cases it could be customer as well, because the information often gets lost in translation. And if your engineers are not involved in those processes, if the team is not involved in those processes, that information often gets filtered down, and some critical information may just get missed. So at that point, from that standpoint, what we start doing is involve in crucial meetings, involve as many team members as possible. Of course, we don't want to waste everybody's time, but make sure that we're introducing them directly to the stakeholders, to the customers, if that's the case in your project, so that they have that direct communication with them and they know who they are. So if there is a question that they have, they don't have to go through the team leadership and ask that questions, because that's inefficient, and things often get lost in that kind of translation.
So even if you have these teams that are empowered because there's an integrated set of practices that they're doing around DevOps, and they're autonomous in their ability to gather requirements, at some point, if all these teams are individually on their own slice, they're going to have to interact with each other in order for the larger picture to be cohesive. What can organizations do to make sure that communication happens effectively?
Have lots and lots of meetings. No, just kidding. So I go back to the example that Scott Hanselman talks about in his different talks that he has given, blog posts, things like that. So it's about teaching the other people how to communicate with you and how to interact with you. So he gives an example of emails. So let's say you're working from 8 to 5, that's your normal working hour. Somebody sends an email to you at 11 o'clock at night, and then you reply to that email right away. Then what you're teaching them is that you're available outside of your business hours, and then you can respond to whatever the query is. Of course, there are matters that are important, and it's very likely that somebody's not going to send you an emergency email. They're very likely to call you. So if it's an email, it can definitely wait until the next morning when you come into your regular shift of work. So that's the kind of training that you're giving. So instead of waiting, instead of responding to them right away at that moment, even though you know the answer and you want to quickly answer it, you may even type it out if you want, but don't hit the send button. Wait until the next day, because if it's not an emergency, you can always send that email in the regular business hour. That means you're teaching them that yes, you are prompt in your replies, and you're available during the business hours that you have set for yourself. So they know when to expect an answer for you. You're kind of setting an SLA for yourself at that point. You're setting that boundary. Other example that I really like and kind of fall back to is from open source world. So this identity server library that we use often in our projects. When I was using it one time, I thought there was a bug in our library. So I was very convinced that, okay, this is what I found, and I'm going to put an issue in GitHub. So I went there and I clicked on new issue for that library. And when I clicked on that, they came up, they show a template of, oh, have you done this? Have you done that? Where's the log? What step did you take? Like, so there's like 7 or 8 steps that 7 or 8 questions that they ask you before you even can create that issue. So once you're going through those steps, that can serve as a rubber ducky for your own problem, and that's what happened with me. So when I was going through those steps, so that's what I was missing, and it's not really a bug. It was something that I was doing wrong, and I was able to fix my own problem without bothering them at all. So they're teaching me without talking to me how to solve my own problems. They're making me independent. Number 2, they're also telling me how to, give them enough information so that they can help me. So if you just put an issue on any library or any project and say, oh, I got an error, I can't get to XYZ side of the application, that doesn't really help anybody. So the developer is going to ask, what did you do? Where did you click? What are you talking about? So that information, if you can ask and kind of create that contract beforehand, saying, oh, this is how you are going to tell me, and you're going to create an issue in my business area. A lot of people will just solve their own problem. They'll learn while doing so, and give you enough information if there's a real issue that you can solve, and kind of like you're fast forwarding that process of just, oh, what's happening? Where's the log? Things like that. You're just giving that information beforehand to them and teaching them how to interact with you and making things more efficient.
It almost sounds there that what you're suggesting is that a team maintains a contract with the outside world or with other teams, almost like if we as developers were maintaining a public API, we'd have it documented. We'd explain to people how to make changes or request changes, report bugs, how to use it. And so I think the really important concept there is that communication style or expectations is documented and it's discoverable for everybody. And that accomplishes a couple of things. It establishes a cultural norm for communication as far as how your team operates, but it also allows other teams to self-service information, so they don't also always have to have kind of that synchronous communication.
Right. The way we document our APIs, so that way it didn't come out of nowhere, because that's efficient. People that enables self-discovery. So we want to do that. Why can't we do that in our regular team interactions as well? So let's do it.
So I think some of these will apply to this, but when you have communication that's within a team and not with the outside world, what are some of the ways that we can streamline that?
So I touched on this a little bit just in Yogi's example of communication across teams, but it's a really important concept, the concept of asynchronous versus synchronous communication. I'm not sure everybody gives this much thought. I think it's natural for us to kind of gravitate towards the most efficient form of communication, and a lot of times I see that being synchronous, but as developers, as creative individuals, we require large periods of uninterrupted time. And so if we can establish team norms and communication norms that prefer asynchronous communication, either sending an email or maybe a Slack message, if a team can agree that there's what the expectation for responding to Slack messages is, then that can really help people maintain their focus if that medium is chosen really based on the criticality of the information that's needed. There's a couple of things there that I think that are beneficial in addition to just allowing people to maintain focus, is that when we focus on the written form for communication, that information is captured, it's visible. If it's preferably in a place that's discoverable by everybody else, that information can be preserved and referenced in the future. I find also when I focus on written communication, it really forces me to think through in detail and establish the thoughts that I'm presenting to other people, and that's very beneficial because having to write things out, it typically forces me to think through things in more detail than I would naturally if I was just going into a meeting.
Yeah, that's some of that self rubber duckying too. One time that I always think about, like, when is it time to document and share this out, is after I fix something, like some error, just to let folks know about what it was and how they might fix it if it comes up again. What are some other or some healthy ways to react to failures like that besides just writing it down when something unexpected happens? How do we deal with that effectively?
Yeah, so as we're working on all these complicated systems, even if it is a seemingly simple web application, things tend to go wrong. Even if you take infinite amount of precautions in production, something you should be prepared for that failure. Because sometimes it's easier to react to those failures because you can't really prevent each and every one of them. So how do we react to those failures is very important, and of course, the application architecture and all those things matter as well. But let's say something catastrophic, a system-wide outage happened, then first of all, we need to concentrate on let's fix it. It doesn't matter uh, whose commit it was. We don't have to go and chase that person down and see why did you commit this code and all that stuff. And if that's the case, we can do that later on in a sense that, okay, this is the code. Concentrate on the commit instead of the committer. And then let's look at that, and if that's the code that broke the production and caused an outage, then there's something wrong with our process. We should have caught that. And that's the kind of approach that you can take. So if somebody makes a mistake, and anybody can make a mistake, everybody makes them. So that gets caught before it causes a major outage somewhere down in production or test environments, whatever it could be. So that's the kind of approach that we should take. And what that does, it builds the team camaraderie and lessens the team animosity between people, saying, hey, we're not here, like I said, we're not attacking we don't want to attack anyone because they made a mistake. It's okay, everybody can make a mistake. It's okay to make that mistake. That's the kind of culture that we want to move forward with. And if that happens, A, we catch it early on, and B, if still it goes through everything, then we respond to it as a team and fix it.
That concept of blamelessness is important. I think another aspect to addressing feedback that's worth evaluating is how we go about collecting that information. Retrospectives, I think, are a pretty common agile practice in a lot of organizations that I've worked with. But what I've noticed is that a lot of teams just kind of seem to go through the motion, and I'm not sure that a lot of teams are getting the full value out of that practice as possible. I think one of the issues there may be that it's easy to walk into a meeting like that kind of cold without having something well prepared to share and kind of a suggestion for changes. And then, for the people that are receiving that feedback or evaluating that feedback, it may be the first time that they've considered it. They don't really have an opportunity outside of that moment to really consider the information. So one thing that organizations could consider doing is taking that type of feedback asynchronous, like we talked about. So that, again, focusing on written form, really allowing people the time and opportunity to expand their thoughts, and then giving everybody else on the team the time to consume that and ask questions and evaluate it. I think it's also important that we consciously track this information when feedback or when situations do arise, so that there's a clear process for making sure that feedback is addressed and that information is captured. So when we're executing on projects, a lot of teams use Kanban boards for making their work visible, which is another DevOps concept and practice of agile approaches. We can do the same thing for feedback. So we can make feedback conform to a standard process of making sure that it's investigated and it's assigned, and that a result is determined, and that's captured and documented and published so that it's discoverable. Yep.
And then this process doesn't have to be, so one of the things that we were talking about earlier, what kind of trouble the teams run into is that if you make this kind of a forced process, that kind of, it's very unnatural. So you can use an opportunity, like something that went wrong, that could be a great time to do a retrospective. Let's just trace the steps back and see what happened. How did this happen? That's a great opportunity. People may have lots of feedback, something meaningful to add to that conversation, instead of, nope, every 2 weeks we just sit here and talk about what happened last 2 weeks. So that could be a lot. So like when there's an incident that you're talking about, there's a lot of important nuggets of information that you can track, that you can add into your documentation, you can add into your ticketing process, whatever it could be.
So a space like that where it's okay to fail and we're sort of expected to have, the unexpected, and the team is committed to learning from it and growing from it and documenting it, writing it all down, really makes me think of scientific experimentation. I know Google's really famous for allowing their development teams to experiment freely for a certain amount of time. Can we apply that sort of attitude in the DevOps space as well?
Absolutely. And, a lot of times the tools that we're bringing in, the approaches that we're bringing in, maybe the architecture pattern that we're bringing in, we can't really tell if it's going to succeed or not. And we can't really take on a $2 million, $20 million project and then say, yeah, this is the magic tool, this is the magic principle, this is the magic architecture that's just going to get you to the other side. We can't really do that. That we don't know, to be quite honest. Like a lot of times we just can't tell. You can do a lot of analysis beforehand, but in the end, you have to walk that whatever tool or practice or principle through the real deal, right? You just put it in the prime time world and see how that looks like. So you're creating these fail-safe environments where you're trying out things, and if it fails, no big deal. You can just take it out because your experimentation was small. You created that fail-safe environment. And how do we do that fail-safe environment? How do we create that fail-safe environment? The first step is to have good observability in place. That's a topic in itself, but understand that you're collecting the good monitoring data around your application. You're just not monitoring for the sake of monitoring. You're collecting good information, good telemetry about your application, so you know beforehand that something's about to go wrong, and you can stop something when, before something becomes a huge problem. So that kind of stuff that you can introduce, you can, at that point, if the experiment is completely going sideways, you just say, oh, no, we don't want this. Like this particular thing that we rolled out is not going to work. We want to take it out because we are collecting data that's not what we expected. So before it becomes a big problem, we took it out. So a lot of times when these experiments are happening in more successful organizations, the customers don't even know it, but this stuff is happening because it's done so seamlessly and so cleverly that you're creating this environment where people are always making changes, always pushing the envelope as far as the innovation is concerned, coming up with creative ways of solving problems, more efficient ways of solving problems, because the experimentation is allowed. It's main because you're making the decisions once we have this experimentation in a data-driven fashion, instead of saying, oh, I just love XYZ tool, or I just love XYZ principle. Yeah, you can theorize that, but then you want to collect the data and make that process more scientific. That way, the risk involved when you take it to the prime time and make a huge change, the bigger change is lesser, and so on and so forth.
So we've been talking about experimentation and about these fail-safe environments, but those are isolated within a team, that they're working on this. Ideally, the outside world doesn't know that you've been experimenting, that you're causing a ruckus inside your own little silo. When you have independent teams that are doing all this discovery, how do you make sure that that's shared and learned and informed on an organizational level?
So I really think this depends on kind of what's available within an organization, but some good options for sharing information across teams within, especially within a large organization, in my opinion, would include something like community of practice meetings. So if we have these autonomous teams, there's still specialties within the teams that can collaborate on certain aspects of that role. So perhaps it's development, or perhaps it's QA. It's an awesome opportunity to share information across those teams by establishing sort of regular rhythms for those specialties, and that might be an opportunity to kind of share what's working for one team with other teams. Another aspect, I guess, more generally along the similar lines, is company brown bags. So these are typically at HeadSpring. These are open to the entire company, and can be on a broad range of topics, not just necessarily development or engineering, but project management or finance, or just anything that somebody's interested in. And so that if your company does that or is interested in doing that type of thing, it's a good opportunity to share what's working for one team versus another. Pairing can be another opportunity for that. So just kind of working individually on certain things if it affects multiple teams. And then just good documentation, right? So we talked about documenting the way we communicate between teams and within teams, but really documenting the cultural norms of your team and how you're working and the way you're approaching work is a good way to one, capture those norms, and then that can be shared throughout the organization as well.
So I think these are all really great ideas for improving communication between teams with a whole lot of written artifacts, and making sure that the environment is safe for teams to fail and to collaborate autonomously. But at the very beginning of this, we mentioned accountability and priorities and how to kind of keep teams aligned on that. What are some ways that organizations can validate that that's all going well?
So I think the concept of measurement is really important within an organization, because everything that we measure has a de facto incentive. Yogi, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the book Accelerate. I think there's a really nice section in there that talks about different things that can be measured. One of those includes lead time. So how fast can a team define and deliver functionality? Another one of those is deployment frequency. Time to restore service, and change fail rate are the others. Change fail rate being how many failures or issues are associated with every change that we make. The thing that I really like about these measurements is that they focus on outcomes, and they talk about that in the book as well. I think it's easy and natural to focus on measuring output, but outcomes is really what the customer, the client, cares about. And if we measure those, then the entire team can be accountable for them. I think it's also important for these metrics to be visible and accessible, but most importantly, owned by the team.
Right, like it's about what you're incentivizing, right? Like the change, and that's what people are going to do. If you concentrate on outputs and then create or spend a lot of time in those burn down charts, then people are incentivized to game those potentially. Let's say there's a change that takes only half hour just to make my chart look better. I may put it as 3 days and then get it done earlier. And then yes, look, I look good. And the burn down chart here, I finished 3 days worth of work. So things like that allows for you to incorrectly incentivize people, and then people are more concentrated on those things instead of actually delivering value to the customer. And that's the mentality that Bill's talking about, which is outcome based.
So with all this in mind, all of these cultural norms that we want to establish and these things that we want to measure to make sure that we're executing on DevOps effectively, where do we start? Where can an organization, just regardless of where you are, in a hierarchy, what can you start doing today?
So one way is to start by documenting your current culture or writing out your current culture. I find that if I can't write something down, I'm going to have a hard time explaining it to another person. So if you want to if you have an idea of where you want to be, but you don't know where you're starting, a good way to figure that out is by writing it down. Perhaps your role within an organization doesn't have the authority necessary to implement a lot of what we've discussed today. A good way to still affect change is by starting with yourself. So in the example of communication, for instance, if you understand the value of asynchronous communication and being diligent about selecting a proper medium for a given situation, start by establishing that norm for yourself. And then have those discussions with your team members and mention, hey, I've been trying this. What do you think? Is it working out? See if you can get your team to try out some of these concepts and cultural norms. And then just as we were talking about how we could spread that from one team to other teams, apply some of those techniques that we were talking as far as taking advantage of brown bags or community practice meetings, or documenting your culture, updating it if you've found some norms or some practices that have worked out for your team, to share those throughout the organization.
Yeah, thinking about sharing those reminds me of something that we just did at Headspring with the Building the Better Way that's online, where we took what our dev teams have been doing and wrote it down and shared it internally, and then ultimately shared it, with the rest of everyone to sort of see how do we work and how do we do things. But it's a good example of how that, yeah, you start with the little behaviors and habits and work for yourself and just build and build till you got everybody on board for it, but only if it works.
Right, and then it's not like we are saying, yep, today we're going to start working on this documentation called Better Way. It's built over time, so you don't have to be intimidated by that, saying, oh, if you don't have something like that, then, oh, I can't do anything. No, you start somewhere small, start documenting things, start making changes. You'll learn a lot and apply those changes as you learn.
Yeah, definitely. So, just to sort of recap all of this, it's really about building those norms, starting to establish them until they grow. And just if your organization as a whole is following these cultural norms, they can really help in delivering value to the customers faster by sort of removing the barriers, removing those things that are keeping DevOps from being truly effective. All of those, the frictions and the blockers that get in the way. These norms help prevent those, and that's where the value comes from. So now I think we've got some time for questions before we wrap up. I've got one here that says, so if we assume that we're living the dream of fully autonomous teams, distributed architecture, microservices, we've got really strong analytics, and we're doing great on agile delivery, that's setting the scene. If this is a complex, real-time, mission-critical system with a high degree of configurability, what is the best way to decide how much to shield the dev teams from the detailed questions and issues that might come in from the end users? So how do we protect, or how much do you protect dev teams as the cruff is kind of coming from the outside world?
Well, I think you could answer this by saying, by asking, like, how do we make that manageable for everybody, right? If we've got a well-established, process and documentation for engaging with the team and collecting information from the customer, the client, the user, then I think there's ways that you can make that manageable. I think that the important aspect, though, is that we don't silo individual team members into their specialty. So maybe if your team has a business analyst, it's not only the business analyst that has relationships with the client or the customer who understands intimately what they need and what they're looking for. And I think that's important because if everybody on the team is responsible for adding value and delivery, there's a specialty to that each individual on the team can add into defining how products work. So it's not necessarily just a product manager who can come up with the best solution to meet the customer's needs. If a developer understands that intimately, then they can add a technical aspect to that solution. Maybe there's a way we can provide what the customer needs in half the time by taking a slightly different approach from a technical standpoint. So there's always going to be a balance between managing interruption and kind of full exposure. But I think if our processes are well documented and published and defined for interacting with the team and that information, and we really focus on the heart of what we're trying to accomplish there, I think we can make that manageable.
I think it relates to some of what Yogi was saying about training other folks how to interact with you. You know, even if you're familiar, if a customer's familiar with everyone's face on the team, you know, when you have a problem like this, you send it to this person and yeah, focus on what's actually effective for those individuals to work.
Right, and then at that point, if you set that contract saying just don't ping right and left to us about emergency things that are happening, because you know we have all been there where you know the things are coming in, the messages are coming in thick and fast. Everybody's has an emergency. Everybody has a higher priority, and the things you know always are getting out of control. So of course, but at that point, it's up to us and how to respond to them, and then how to teach them how to talk to us. So establishing those boundaries, establishing those communication patterns, and just creating filters as well that can work. Just go to one person at first, maybe project manager, business analyst. If there's a query, if it falls through all of your processes, async processes that you have in place, then talk to a certain person, and maybe they'll involve other people as needed, so that engineers are not getting pulled into every single conversation that's happening in the organization.
Sounds like limit a little bit, train who's asking you, and be prepared to not have it perfect on the first try, right? Be ready to experiment and find out what works. Here's another question, and thanks for these, y'all, keep them coming. What types of items should we be looking at when we're trying to document or outline the current culture, and as well as what a future or desired culture looks like?
So, of course, for any change that you want to make, you want to know what today's world looks like, and that's what you want to document first. Let's say I have a team that's, like I said, what I was talking about earlier, that deploys code to production, but they don't actually develop things. So if we write that down, then we can track back certain inefficiencies related to that, and that's what happened with us. When we were building this microservices project, there was a team of operations folks. They started attending the stand-ups. That's a change that we started introducing into these into the existing structure, within the existing structure of the company. That was possible. That introduced a little bit of change. That you know they started learning about what the developers are up to, so that they're not getting surprised when the features actually built out completely. So we started making everybody part of the process, and those are the little changes that you can start incorporating once you have once you have documented what your current process looks like. It could be just a picture, simple picture. You can use tools like Draw.io. Just draw like a few blocks saying, oh, this is what we do. This is how we collect our information. Then it goes to engineers. Then it goes to the operation folks over here. They test it, deploy things like that.
Right. I think as far as like individual items to evaluate for kind of establishing where you're currently at and where you want to be, it's a lot of what we talked about during the presentation. So, you know, communication would be one, measurement would be another, blamelessness for responding to failure. I believe I may have already mentioned measurement. So really, you know, I think those are some areas to start with, and then you kind of have to think through what's important for your organization. What are things that you can focus on that are really going to help you drive value in your particular case with your customers?
That all sounds really good. Okay, start with everything, but focus on what works. It all can be important. Here's another one. So there is some mixed mention about friction between teams because of the structure. Just kind of looking to expand on that, what does a good team structure look like?
That's right. I think a good team structure is one that aligns to the customer, client, or user versus a specialty vertical or a job role. I think it's also important that the entire team owns the client experience and is accountable for the same metrics. I don't think there's necessarily one team structure that's going to, or even size that's going to work for every organization. But I think that it's the key things that we talked about as far as accountability and autonomy are very important. So rather than each job specialty having different accountability and metrics that they're measured by, the whole team is treated as a cohesive unit. I think what's important is that we avoid creating scenarios where certain roles are given accountability over something without any authority to affect change in that area. I think that's really easy to do and something to be aware of when you're evaluating the structure of your teams. I think there's also some expectations within teams that we can expect everybody to be a part of, regardless of role or specialty. Something like quality, for instance, it's not just a QA person's responsibility and concept to be accountable over quality. It's really everybody's responsibility. So there has to be full team ownership of that.
Yogi, anything to add?
No, Bill covered it all.
Great. All right. Well, here's another one for y'all. I think on the topic of measurement and some of that, I guess on norms as well, but can you talk more about the relationship between development frequency and culture?
Yeah, so when we're talking about deployments and developments and all these things, like when we're doing our engineering goal is to deliver value to our customer, right? So at that point, what we want to look at, what we can do to make that faster. Google's DevOps report goes into it. More frequently you deploy, the smaller your deployment is, lesser the risk is. So you're deploying faster, you're learning lessons quickly, you're failing fast, and if there's a problem, you quickly take that change back and then fix the problem and move on with your life. But then the team structures and the cultural issues that we discussed throughout the webinar, what happens is when they start coming in the way, they slow this entire process down. And because we looked at we as an engineering team, we developed a code and we tossed it over the fence to the operations team and they're maintaining it forward. If we have that kind of a structure, then it introduces friction between operations team and development team. And that can slow down my deployment frequency, that can add risk to my deployment. That means it can slow down my deployment. And again, that's a vicious cycle. And that's a negative feedback. That's where we're feeding into the process and making the whole experience not only just frustrating, but the customers are not getting the value. We're wasting time from engineering team, and we're not delivering value to our customers. So business goal in itself is not met.
Here's one on the communication front. What are some of the warning signs that our team's communication could be better?
I think one thing that would stand out to me is if you're having to have repeated conversations, right? If a conversation happens and not everybody who needs to kind of know the outcome of that is aware, and so a conversation has to happen 2 or 3 times, that could be an indicator that maybe there's something there to look at as far as an efficiency gain. Something else that I tend to notice is if the number of people in meetings who aren't participating is high. that could be an indicator that maybe that form of communication for that particular situation wasn't the best choice, or maybe not everybody in the meeting is clear on their role. And if we're going to bring people together as a form of communication, it's important that everybody's clear and has an understanding of what the expectation for their role in that meeting is. So there's a couple of things that come to mind.
Yeah, and then those meetings, for the the meetings that are really large, when a lot of people are involved and they don't have any specific agenda. We've been there a lot of times. These meetings get called, but then everybody's kind of looking at each other's face. What are we talking about? What's the deal? At that point, people who are outgoing, they'll keep they'll start talking about things, and then it completely goes off the rails and loses the purpose of the meeting. So you want to make sure that you have clear communication on the agenda. This is what we're going to talk about in the meeting. And you can also send out a communication beforehand as a homework item to people saying, come prepared for this meeting if you can, and include that documentation link, whatever you may have in the meeting agenda, and saying that, okay, you have read through the things that we're going to talk about. And sometimes in my experience, what has happened is, oh, they read through the document that we were going to discuss. The other party said, yeah, it looks good to me. And then I said, okay, sounds good to me. So we agree on things. Yeah, then there's no need to have a meeting. So if a meeting gets canceled and gets converted into an email or just a documentation page somewhere, it's always great. But if you're constantly getting into these big meetings without agendas, a lot of people involved, and you feel like you sat through the entire day being busy, your calendar is triple booked, but you're not achieving anything, that's a big red flag for me.
Thinking about what things you can move to be asynchronous instead of synchronous in those meetings. Another thing that makes me think about some like a misapplication of some of these ideas that we've talked about, wanting to make something like a community of practice, like make new groups that are across teams. When you do that, make sure that the group has a purpose, that they have a reason to be there. That isn't just, because these guys on this webinar said that they were cool. Make sure that that group has a reason to meet, and their conversations are valuable.
Don't cargo cult.
That's right. Well, I think we're coming up at about as much time as we had for questions, but thank you all for sending those in. Even though our synchronous time here is ending, there are asynchronous ways to get in touch with us. There's lots of information on headspring.com. We've got blogs and past webinars, and this one will be up there to watch the recording of. There's a podcast that I hear is pretty good. There's also, you can email info@headspring.com if you have specific questions. There's also Twitter @Headspring. I think we're on Twitter too. We're on GitHub on Headspring Labs. You can find us. And finally, you can go to betterway.headspring.com to see sort of what we've put out there into the world for what some of our processes and cultures are. And that's also on GitHub, so it's growing and changing. You can file an issue if you have a question there. Really take advantage of those communication artifacts. So thanks everybody for attending, and until next time, take it easy.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.